When global food prices spike, the standard macroeconomic assumption points to a familiar culprit: energy shocks or sudden military conflicts disrupting supply lines. But econometric modeling of the World Bank's Global Food Price Index tells a different story about where the costs actually lie. This chart deconstructs the World Bank's General Food Price Index to isolate individual production inputs. After controlling for other variables, energy accounts for a statistically insignificant 4.7% of the overall cost share in food production. Look at the towering bar next to it. Fertilizer accounts for a massive 42% cost share in that same index. For specific commodities like maize and wheat, that number approaches half of the total production cost. This market is a quasi-cartelized oligopoly. A tiny fraction of firms completely control the mining, logistics, and export infrastructure required to produce the world's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. When geopolitical choke points close and global supply tightens, these dominant firms do not increase output to meet demand. Instead, they restrict capacity to maximize their profit margins. These market dynamics leave the global food supply vulnerable to localized shocks, placing a direct and escalating pressure on national security frameworks. Extracting and processing the three primary agricultural nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, requires immense capital investment. It involves acquiring land rights, building sprawling mines, and constructing specialized logistics networks. Because of these extreme barriers to entry, producers form export associations like Canpotex and Phoschem. These entities operate as de facto cartels, often enjoying explicit legal exemptions from standard antitrust enforcement. To understand how these cartels operate during a crisis, we can examine the global food price spikes of 2007 and 2008. This graph tracks the 45% surge in global food prices during that period. Between 2007 and 2012, the fertilizer cartel imposed an average price overcharge of 63%. That specific overcharge alone accounts for 60% of the total increase shown here. The 2008 crisis demonstrated how the oligopoly behaves when the global system is under stress, extracting wealth at the exact moment of peak instability. Any subsequent supply disruption is fed into a market already structurally designed to exploit scarcity for maximum financial gain. The fragility of this system was exposed in 2021 and 2022, when Western nations imposed heavy sanctions on Belarusian potash. Lithuania halted the use of its railway network, cutting off transit to the port of Klaipėda. Because Belarus and Russia export roughly a fifth of the world's fertilizers, this specific logistical bottleneck removed massive volumes of potash from the international market. For regions highly dependent on these imports, the fallout was immediate. The sudden disappearance of Belarusian supply led directly to a 16.1% drop in Africa's cereal harvest in 2022. That vulnerability compounded with the escalation of conflict in Iran in early 2026, which severely restricted access to the Strait of Hormuz. At just 21 miles wide, this narrow waterway is a critical conduit. Up to 30% of all internationally traded fertilizers pass through it. This visualization of UN FAO data shows the exact volume of transit trade. Following the outbreak of conflict in February 2026, maritime traffic collapsed. Dry bulk and general cargo volumes plummeted by more than 95% in a matter of weeks. This graph also illustrates the immediate financial shock. As transit volumes collapsed, nitrogen prices at the Port of New Orleans jumped 32% in a single week. Because the industry relies on a highly concentrated, centralized supply chain, a localized regional conflict instantly translates into a global input shortage. Standard market logic dictates that when prices spike due to a supply shock, producers increase output to capture demand. The fertilizer oligopoly behaves differently. Corporate strategy in this sector prioritizes margin protection and capital discipline, what the industry calls value over volume. In April 2026, precisely as the Hormuz crisis drove global prices upward, Mosaic announced the idling of its Araxá phosphate complex in Brazil, removing approximately 1 million tons of annual production from a tightening market. This is the farmer's dilemma. When dominant firms deliberately reduce capacity, the financial burden is pushed entirely onto downstream agricultural producers, leaving them with three destructive options in response to an input price shock. If a farmer decides to simply reduce fertilizer use, crop yields immediately collapse. If they try to switch to nitrogen-fixing crops like soybeans to save money, it triggers a systemic shortage of staple grains like wheat and corn. The final option is to absorb the inflated costs, which have historically risen much faster than crop prices. For many producers, this erases their profit margins entirely and leads directly to farm bankruptcy. The oligopoly is financially rewarded for engineering artificial scarcity, while the farmers and the global food system bear the entirety of the risk. State actors have realized that agricultural inputs can no longer be governed by standard trade protectionism. Securing these materials requires a structural shift in Western geopolitical strategy. In February 2026, the U.S. government officially added elemental phosphate and potash to the National Critical Minerals list, treating them with the same strategic urgency as rare earth elements used in defense manufacturing. Concurrently, the Department of Justice opened an investigation into potential price coordination among the major fertilizer producers. This policy shift led to the U.S. voluntarily dismissing a 5-year trade protection case. The government dropped punitive tariffs that had heavily favored the domestic monopoly, Mosaic, at the expense of American farmers. The strategic target of this tariff dismissal was the OCP Group. This Moroccan state-owned enterprise is the custodian of over 70% of the world's known phosphate reserves. Washington requires unrestricted access to Moroccan phosphate. By deepening this economic alliance, the U.S. aims to block China and Russia from capturing the African agricultural market with their own zero-tariff initiatives. In this environment, food security has become inseparable from resource-anchored diplomacy. The soil that feeds the West is only as secure as the critical mineral supply chains that determine its yield.